Thank you. For the debate, the member for Parkdale Hyde Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an absolute pleasure. It's an honour to be a co-sponsor. Yet again, you heard from the member from Whitby, Oshawa, about the number of times we've co-sponsored this bill, the number of times it's come before us, and the number of times it's passed second reading, only to kind of die on the order paper. That can't happen, because the point, there's one I want to make, it's this. This is a grandparents' rights bill, but it's really a children's rights bill as well. It's about the rights of children to have access to their grandparents, to the entire family history, to their culture, sometimes to their language. So it truly is a children's rights bill. And I speak very personally about this, Mr. Speaker, because I want to share my story. Were it not for my grandmother, I probably wouldn't be standing here today. I want you to picture my grandmother, long since now deceased. She was a very Victorian lady. Her hair actually came right down to the middle of her backside, and she braided it and wrapped it around her head, very Victorian, and at night she would brush it out 100 brush strokes. I still remember my grandmother, who was in her 80s at the time, and you normally don't think of women in their 80s as beautiful, but as a little girl, watching her brush her hair with one blonde streak in it and thinking, what a beautiful woman. She also was a very strong woman. She was an artist, a painter. Her maiden name was Patrick. Her married name was Wilson, and she always signed her paintings Wilson Patrick, because in those days, she thought, and she was probably right, you couldn't sell a painting if it had a woman's name on it. So she was an artist, and we grew up on Bedford, which sounds shishi, but it wasn't back then. We ran a rooming house on Bedford, and she ran it. My grandfather died before I was born. She ran the rooming house. She housed my parents that originally moved back there during the Depression. She looked after her children, all four of them, far-flung some of them were, and she looked after her grandchildren too. She also looked after half the cultural heart of the city of Toronto. Rita McNeil, who recently passed, and shout out to Rita, sang in our house. Glenn Gould played the piano in our house because the Royal Conservatory was just down the street 2 blocks, and my brother was a musician. He used to play in a band some of us old people remember called Lighthouse. So he knew many of these cultural icons, and they used to come and perform. And my grandmother would hold dinners for them. So there was always an artist or two around our table. We never had less than 10 people at our dinner table, with my grandmother sitting at the head of it, carving in the British tradition. That was my grandmother. And she would invite them to paint with her if they were artists, to sing for us if they were singers, to play for us if they were musicians. And also, to complete the picture of my grandmother, who loved to play chess, she always had a little glass of sherry in one hand and a cigarette in the other. So there you go. She called them her coffin nails. So she was quite the gal. But here's where her life and this bill intersect. Because my parents did not have a happy marriage. My parents had a terrible marriage. And when they were together in the house, they were always fighting. And sometimes the fights were pretty violent. Now, had I been left alone only with them, I can't imagine, Mr. Speaker, what that life would have looked like. But my grandmother was the mitigating force. She was the one that basically sent my parents to their corners. She was the one that looked after me in the midst of it. And when she died, I left home. I was 15 at the time, because I couldn't abide living there. And when we think of the street children, of which I was one, think of the street children now, many of them have left homes because of the dysfunctionality of their mothers and fathers, combination thereof, and the lack of any alternative within their families who will look after them, who will give them a safe place to be and to sleep. I often tell the story, it's a story of hope, I think, that when I first was elected and came here, my office overlooked Queen's Park, where sometimes I would sleep as a 16-year-old, because normally I couch surf, but sometimes I wasn't lucky, and that's where I would sleep. And I could look out that window where I slept. Had my grandmother lived, that wouldn't have been the case. Because my grandmother lived, I stand here. Because of her influence, I believe I'm the person I am, not because of my parents, because of her influence. And I can tell you that tradition of grandparents does not change. I have many grandparents in my riding who look after their grandchildren, who have full custody of their grandchildren, who, if it were not for them, their grandchildren will not be the people that they will one day be. Their grandparents look after them for a myriad of reasons, sometimes divorce, sometimes mental health and addiction issues, actually. Thank God for the grandparents who are there, who can step in. And as the member said, and I think it's an important caveat in this bill, this is not automatic, because I know all grandparents aren't like my grandma. I know there are some bad apples. You have to still make application. I know one of the concerns about this bill was this might be a kind of backdoor way, in a divorce, of having the other spouse get. No, you have to make application. And it's in, as the member from Whitby, Oshawa, said so clearly, it's what's in the best interest of the child that the court takes into account, and the court is the mitigating factor here, family court. So, there is an application to be made. It's not automatic, but it's certainly necessary. And, again, the member from Niagara Falls said it clearly, there are many grandparents who have been caught by the lack of this law change, really caught. They don't have access to their grandchildren. They never see their grandchildren. And more to the point, again, to my initial point, this is a children's rights bill. Their children do not have the right to be with them. That's sad. That's absolutely sad, because, Mr. Speaker, they represent our history and our culture, and our history and our culture defines us. Without our history, without that background, who are we truly? They're part of us. And certainly in this era of increasingly small and nuclear families, we have lost in many ways the joy of extended families, of many relatives under the same roof. And all that means, and it means, particularly for women, it means help. It means assistance in raising your children and helping with them. To have that cut off, that's sad. I know for my own children, my parents had died by the time my children came along, and my in-laws live in Chicago, so very long distance. Had not the wonderful experience I had growing up with a grandmother present and there. Again, mitigating factor in my case, essential, crucial factor. My house became unlivable when she died. It became unlivable. I knew that when I was young, that much I knew, but I didn't really realize until I'm standing here today, and years before this, of course, that it truly was her that made the difference. It was her that made the difference. How many of us can say that? Well, the member from Whitby, Oshawa, says that 75,000 grandparents have been caught in this, denied access, wanted access, and have been caught in trying to get access. That's a lot of families. That's a lot of people. And importantly, most sorely importantly, that's a lot of children. We need this law. And I've heard some encouraging words. I know that every decision in this place is made out of corner offices, that one in particular, and around that cabinet table in particular. So please, hopefully, we have two cabinet members in the room right now. I'm hoping that others are listening. I'm hoping that this will get through the cabinet, get through the corner office, come back as law, because then finally families across Ontario can begin to celebrate what is so essential and what should be so obvious. So I just want to, stop with, I started with a picture of my grandmother. I want to end with a picture of my grandmother and dedicate this to her and to you. Thank you for coming, and to all the grandparents out there who are watching, listening, and I know we're participants in writing this bill. I want to say thank you, first of all, and I want to leave you with that image of my grandmother with the hair wrapped around her head, with a little glass of sherry. There's always one, always little. A glass of sherry every night, her medicinal sherry, with her coffin nail in her hand. Sometimes she'd put the sherry glass down and pick up the paintbrush and paint marvelous portraits, by the way, of which all of our family members now have one at least. And she would hold court, really, it was like a salon, with some of the best and the brightest of Toronto, but truly the only person that she cared most about in that salon, and that who cared most about her, was a little girl named Cheri DiNovo, who sat there and absolutely benefited from her presence and her life. So I thank the member, Kim Crater, for coming up with the bill. I know he didn't do it alone. No grandparents were part of this. I thank the member from Whitby, Oshawa, for co-sponsoring it. And most of all, I thank all the grandparents for all the incredible love they do. And I hope, I really do hope, that one day I get to be one too. Thank you.